Hello, it's Joe Simhart here again. Thanks for tuning in. This is a follow-up on my last video that was done on Liana Shanti and her influence and some of her sources. So what I want to look at here is something called basic assumptions and basic assumption states that cults fall into. Sometimes the basic assumptions are quite false or develop dependencies about who they can rely on for information, who meaning the group. So the two basic assumptions I want to look at here, especially in what we call the New Age movement and among psychics, is the concept of Lemuria, as if it was an ancient nation like Atlantis that had collapsed in the past, and the idea of Akashic Records, or that etheric realm of space where all thoughts, actions, karma is collected in some kind of a God consciousness that psychics can tap into. People like Teal Swan or Liana Shanti, and there's an endless array of these people, claim they can tap into the Akashic Records. So let's see what we're talking about here. A lot of this was invented or concocted or inspired by Madame Blavatsky, who lived between 1831 to 1891. Yeah, she was around 60 when she died. So here's a book about her. It's called The Masters Revealed, Madame Blavatsky and the Myth of the Great White Lodge by K. Paul Johnson. And I read this book when it came out, and I've communicated with the author. He was a theosophist who took a deep dive into looking at just what were the sources of Blavatsky's information. She claimed to channel information or to be the amanuensis for 5 male masters. 3 of them painted on the cover of this book. There's Saint Germain to her left. Above her is the Master Moria, and then there is Kuthumi. So the stories behind them, Saint Germain was a historical character, highly exaggerated in modern myth. The other 2 didn't exist. They were made-up characters in Blavatsky's imagination, Moria and Kuthumi. So what K. Paul Johnson does is shows that basic assumption that she's in touch with, supposedly adepts that are in touch with the ancient wisdom and the Akashic Records or whatever, they didn't really exist. This is something she concocted out of her deep interest in occultism, her studies of maybe 100 books, and Rosicrucianism, Eliphas Levi. I could go on about her influences, all of which are suspect in terms of their wisdom and knowledge. So let's look at Lemuria. So Lemuria is this ancient continent. In some cases, it was 35,000 years ago. It's sunk. In others, maybe 5,000, 6,000 years ago. It depends on your source. So I'm going to read from Wikipedia. Lemuria was a continent proposed in 1864 by zoologist Philip Schlachter, theorized to have sunk beneath the Indian Ocean, later appropriated by occultists in supposed accounts of human origins. The theory was discredited with the discovery of plate tectonics and continental drift in the 20th century. So this is a modern occult idea. Blavatsky, again, was a big source of it, that has continued to be a meme among New Agers. The hypothesis was proposed as an explanation for the presence of lemur fossils in Madagascar and India, but not in Africa or the Middle East. Biologist Ernst Haeckel suggested in 1870 that Lemuria could be the ancestral home of mankind, caused the hypothesis to move beyond the scope of geology and zoogeography, ensuring its popularity outside of the framework of the scientific community. Occultist and founder of Theosophy, Helena Blavatsky, right, during the latter part of the 19th century, placed Lemuria in the system of her mystical religious doctrine, claiming that this continent was the homeland of the human ancestors, whom she called Lemurians. The writings of Blavatsky had a significant impact on Western occultism, Popularizing the myth of Lemuria and its mystical inhabitants, theories about Lemuria became untenable when in the 1960s the scientific community accepted Alfred Wegener's theory of continental drift. Presented in 1912, but the idea lived on in the popular imagination, especially in relation to the theosophical tradition. I found it in the cult I was in Church Universal and Triumphant. They talked about Lemuria and Atlantis and all this other crap that psychics come up with. And it's also big in the Ramtha cult. The god Ramtha that's channeled by J.Z. Knight is supposedly from ancient Lemuria and conquered people in Atlantis or whatever. I don't know. Complicated, but if you read it, you'll see what I mean. So, yeah, look at K. Paul Johnson's book if you want to dispel any ideas you have about these ascended masters. They don't exist. They're in the imaginations of the so-called channel or psychic. And so the other thing I want to look at is the Akashic Records, which the many psychics, including Liana Shanti, who we're looking at here, claim exists as some kind of an etheric library that she can tap into because she's this wonderful, incredible psychic who lives on Earth now and channels Jesus for us, much like Blavatsky channeled Moria. So there's 42 definitions of Akasha. It comes from Sanskrit. It essentially means sky or space. It has nothing to do with records of memory or activity or karma on Earth. So I'll give you a couple of definitions. In Kavya poetry, and I'll put a link to this for you, the source is Shaivism, or in other words, the worship of the god Shiva, and in the Tantric traditions, or Kavya in India. So Akasha refers to sky, as I said, according to this particular verse in the scripture. Due to the power arisen, this whatever, all right, I'm not going to get into this, but basically whenever you see Akasha, it means sky or that space around Earth. In the Ganita Shastra, or mathematics and algebra in India, Akasha represents the number 0. And you can understand that this relates to empty space, to sky. In other words, there's nothing there. There are no thoughts, there are no energies, there is no karma, there's no ether. There's literally nothing. It's a void, it's 0. So that's what it means in that numerical system. And there's 40 other definitions of it, which have nothing to do with this crazy idea that psychics use about the Akashic Records and them being able to tap into it. So if the basic assumption in your particular cult or group or new religion is that there are Akashic Records and the psychic can tap into them, or that there are ascended masters and the psychic can channel them or whatever, you're wrong. You're going to go down a rabbit hole and you're going to come out the other end empty, as in Akasha, 0. There's going to be nothing there. So in this book, which I've had since the 1970s, it's written by John Godwin, published in 1972, and it's called Occult America. And there's a chapter he has called A Pattern of Psychics. I just want to read one paragraph about Blavatsky. He says, "It is hard to overestimate Madame Blavatsky's influence on the American metaphysical scene. Portions of her teachings have been incorporated in virtually every occult group extant, though mostly without giving her a credit line. Over and over again, I have listened to cult leaders expounding the Blavatsky gospel to their flock as their own uniquely original discoveries or rather revelations. Sometimes I had the feeling that the ghost of the Russian woman was hovering over the audience, slapping her massive thighs and laughing her head off." Yeah, I think a lot of what Blavatsky taught she knew was wrong, but she was one of those people that felt that fooling people in order to gain enlightenment was okay. I don't particularly think that's a good idea, but she did. Anyway, I'll stop there. I just wanted to give an idea of what happens when people have basic assumptions that are essentially false, and that false basic assumption can lead to an entire career of psychic BS and people falling into that rabbit hole and having a hard time getting out in the end and having to recover from that nonsense. So I hope that helps you a little bit. I'll set up some links for you to look at, and thank you for listening again. Have a good day.